video, I want to share 3 common mistakes in understanding God's will. Because I believe if you watch this video, then you think that understanding God's will is very important. And then maybe you are now in a transition, you want to make some important decision in your life, and that's why you are asking, what is God's will? And do I understand God's will correctly? How do I know God's will? And now I want to share these 3 common mistakes that hinders you to find out what God's will is. Because if you have wrong understanding of God's will, then you will never understand, you will never get to the point, get what God's will is. So this video is about the common mistake first. What is God's will in understanding God's will? The first common mistake is you find extra remarkable signs, unusual signs maybe. And because maybe one of the good example is, Moses see a burning bush, right? Burning bush, and yet the bush is not burned. He saw the flame, the fire, and yet the bush is not burned. And he suddenly at least heard God's calling him. Yeah, true, God can call in that way, but it's not common. It's not so many people are called that way. So stop looking for that kind of extraordinary signs. And even though you find some signs, the problem is most people with this kind of mentality, usually they have some signs actually from God, and yet it's very hard for them to believe. It can be just a random luck. It can be just a pure luck, or it can be maybe Satan used the same luck to misdirect me to the wrong direction, and you can come up with a lot of excuses to not doing God's will. So stop looking for extraordinary signs or some unusual signs or whatever. Instead, you should start from understanding God's will from the Bible first. Okay. And then the second mistake is actually right at the extreme opposite of that, which is everything is God's will. So because everything is, no, not everything, maybe those who does not involve sin is God's will. So if you are looking for a job, then you will think, as long as I am not involved in porn industry, then everything is fine. As long as I'm not involved in gambling industry, then everything is fine. Because those are sin, then the rest are okay, then I just fine. Yes, that's true, but I think this is only the first step. Okay, so the first step is you avoid all those that involve sin. Then the second is you need to develop sensitivity to understand which one is God's will. Okay, which one is the best decision. So not too random, then okay, just choose anything, but I can choose this one because this is the best decision. Because this one is the one that I know this is God's will. Yeah. So it's only the first step. The second step is yet to come. So yeah, you need to understand to learn more about that second step. The first mistake is about the signs, looking for signs all the time but never do anything. Second thing is you only avoid sins, and then the rest you just choose randomly. This is not so good, because this is just the first step. The third thing is you find something that is anything that happened to me is God's will. Yeah, this is usually people say because God is sovereign, right? Because God is sovereign, then anything that happened to me is God's will. Okay, there is some truth in that, but the danger is when you face difficulty, then people always interpret it as this is not God's will for me. Once you hit that obstacle, actually in serving God you will always get that obstacle, but it can easily misinterpret as God is directing me, is leading me towards a different way. So there is another things to consider. If Paul used that mentality, when he entered Corinth, he was rejected. And Paul is actually about to move from Corinth and preach the gospel in other place. And yet he didn't. Because God said that there is my people in this place. And you should stay here, you should be consistent in preaching the gospel. That's why we can have the epistle of Corinth, 1st and 2nd Corinthians in the Bible. If Paul is just moving, then we don't have that epistle today. So this is the most common mistake, 3 common mistake. Looking for signs, and you just avoid sin. And then the third thing is you just accept the reality. I mean, whatever things that happen to me, that is God's will. If it's difficult, it's not God's will. Yeah, these are all the 3 common mistake in finding God's will. If you still have any other question, you can comment below, and then you can subscribe to this channel so that you don't miss any of my video. See you next time.